What if the pain you've carried for years, the invisible scars that no one else can see, were not just wounds, but keys? Keys to a hidden world within yourself. Emotional trauma is often spoken of as a brokenness, something we wish could simply vanish. We say, "I want to forget. I want to move on. I want to erase it from my memory." But what if forgetting is not the way? What if your trauma is not only a mark of what happened to you, but also a message, a symbol, and even a map? A map that, if you dare to follow, can lead you toward healing, growth, and even transformation. Carl Jung believed that the deepest wounds of the human soul are not meaningless. They are not random accidents of life. They carry significance. They hold a story, a truth about us that was once pushed into the shadows. To Jung, the human psyche is not simply a machine that breaks down when traumatized. It is more like a living organism, a vast forest filled with hidden paths and unseen creatures. Trauma in this forest is like a fallen tree blocking the way. You cannot ignore it. You cannot wish it away. You must face it, climb over it, or even learn to understand why it fell in the first place. But here lies the paradox. Inside the very wound lies the possibility of renewal. As Jung often suggested, the gold is in the dark. In other words, what we fear, what we avoid, what we repress, the shadow itself, may also contain the treasure we are seeking. This is the radical idea. Healing is not about erasing trauma, but about integrating it, listening to it, and finding meaning within it. This is not a comfortable journey. It is not a quick fix, but it is the path to becoming whole. In this documentary, we will step into Jung's vision of the human mind and explore how he explained the healing of emotional trauma. We will see why he believed that our nightmares, our anxieties, and even our most painful memories are not enemies to destroy, but guides to transformation. We will dive into his ideas of the shadow, of individuation, of symbols and dreams. And we will learn why the process of healing is not about returning to who you were before the trauma, but becoming someone new, someone more complete. So, if you've ever wondered why the past continues to echo in your life, if you've ever asked yourself why old wounds still hurt long after the event is gone, or if you've felt that the pain you carry has shaped you in ways you don't fully understand, stay with us. Because Jung's perspective offers not just answers, but a new way of seeing trauma altogether. Not as a dead end, but as a doorway. A doorway to the depths of the soul, and ultimately, to healing. Part 2. Jung's view of the psyche. To understand how Jung explained the healing of emotional trauma, we first need to enter his vision of the human psyche. For Jung, the mind was not a simple container of thoughts and memories. It was a living system, dynamic and layered, with both visible and invisible dimensions. Think of it like an iceberg. The conscious mind is only the small portion we see above the surface, while the vast, hidden part beneath is the unconscious. Jung divided the psyche into several key parts. At the surface lies the conscious mind, the realm of awareness, where we think, make decisions, and hold our sense of identity. But just below, we find the personal unconscious. This is the storage place of forgotten experiences, repressed memories, and emotions too painful or inconvenient for the conscious mind to carry. This is where much of our unresolved trauma hides. If the conscious mind says, "I want to move forward," the personal unconscious quietly whispers, "Not until you deal with me." But Jung went even further. Beyond the personal unconscious, he described something deeper, the collective unconscious. This is not unique to you or me. It is shared by all humanity. It contains universal patterns, images, and instincts that Jung called archetypes. These are like ancient blueprints of the human experience, symbols of the mother, the hero, the shadow, the wise old man, the trickster. They appear in myths, in religions, and in dreams across every culture. And when trauma strikes, it often activates these archetypal forces inside us, giving our personal pain a universal dimension. Imagine this. When someone suffers abandonment, it is not only their own story of rejection that wounds them. On a deeper level, they might connect with the universal archetype of the orphan, a timeless image of the child left alone. This is why trauma feels so overwhelming. It doesn't just belong to us. It taps into something far greater, something that resonates in the collective soul of humanity. In Jung's model, the psyche is always trying to balance itself, always trying to move toward wholeness. Trauma interrupts this process. It creates what Jung might describe as a splinter in the psyche, an unresolved conflict lodged in the unconscious. Left unacknowledged, this splinter doesn't disappear. Instead, it pushes against the surface of consciousness, appearing in symptoms, anxiety, depression, anger, or recurring destructive patterns. Jung believed that these symptoms are not just problems to suppress, but messages. The psyche is speaking. The trauma is asking to be seen. Consider an example. A person who grew up in a household where anger was dangerous might push all their own anger into the unconscious. As an adult, they might appear calm, even overly kind, but the repressed anger doesn't vanish. It lives in the personal unconscious, and it may erupt unexpectedly, perhaps in sudden outbursts or projected onto others. Jung would say that this is the unconscious trying to restore balance. The trauma has split off part of the person's emotional truth, and until it is integrated, it will continue to return in disguised forms. This is where Jung's perspective becomes so different from many modern views. He did not see trauma only as a pathology to be cured, but as an imbalance to be understood and integrated. The unconscious is not the enemy. It is part of us, containing the very material we need for healing. In fact, Jung often suggested that the psyche itself has a kind of intelligence, an inner drive toward wholeness. The unconscious does not simply want to hurt us, it wants to complete us. When we experience trauma, the conscious mind often reacts by trying to bury it. Forget it. Move on. Don't feel it. But the unconscious will not comply so easily. Instead, it will bring the trauma back, through dreams, through slips of the tongue, through overwhelming emotions, until the conscious mind agrees to listen. For Jung, this dialogue between the conscious and unconscious is essential. Without it, the psyche remains divided, and true healing cannot occur. To make sense of this, let's return to the metaphor of the iceberg. Imagine that a painful event, a childhood humiliation, a betrayal, a sudden loss, sinks below the surface into the personal unconscious. It does not disappear. It waits there, frozen, shaping the way the iceberg moves through the water. We may not see it, but it steers the direction of our lives. Healing begins when we turn our attention inward, when we begin to explore what lies below the surface. Only then can the iceberg begin to move freely, guided not by hidden wounds, but by conscious choice. And yet, Jung also emphasized the collective level. He believed that by facing our personal trauma, we are also engaging with timeless human experiences. This is why so many people find meaning in stories, myths, and spiritual traditions when they are healing. The unconscious speaks in symbols, and those symbols often connect us not just to our own story, but to the story of humanity itself. In this way, trauma is both deeply personal and profoundly universal. So, in Jung's view, the psyche is not a battlefield of random chaos. It is a living system, a dialogue between the conscious and the unconscious, between the personal and the collective. Trauma is not an alien invasion that ruins us. It is a blockage, a wound, a splinter in this system. Painful, yes, but also meaningful. And by understanding where trauma resides in the psyche, we take the first step toward healing. Because once we know where it hides, we can begin the journey of bringing it into the light. Part 3. The Shadow. When Jung spoke about trauma, he often used a word that has become one of the most powerful concepts in psychology: the shadow. What is the shadow? In simple terms, it is everything about ourselves that we reject, deny, or push out of sight. It is the dark cellar of the psyche, filled with emotions, memories, and impulses that the conscious mind cannot or will not accept. From childhood, we are told which parts of us are acceptable and which are not. A child who cries too much might be told, "Stop being weak." A child who shows anger might hear, "Good boys don't behave that way." Little by little, these natural parts of the self are pushed down, hidden away. Over time, they become part of the shadow. Trauma magnifies this process. When we experience something overwhelming, abuse, rejection, betrayal, the feelings linked to that event can be so unbearable that we bury them. We say to ourselves, "That never happened," or "I won't think about it." But the unconscious does not forget. The shadow keeps the memory alive. The paradox of the shadow is this: though we push it away, it continues to live within us. It shows up indirectly, in our fears, in our compulsions, in the way we judge others. Have you ever noticed how strongly you react when someone shows a behavior you despise? Often, Jung would say, that intensity is a clue. You may be seeing your own shadow reflected back at you. For example, a person who has buried their own anger may find themselves constantly irritated by the aggression of others. A person who has repressed their vulnerability may harshly criticize others for being too emotional. In this way, the shadow is projected outward, shaping our relationships and behaviors without us realizing it. Now, what does this mean for trauma? It means that the pain we refuse to face becomes part of the shadow. A child who experienced neglect may grow into an adult who tells themselves, "I don't need anyone." Yet, deep inside, the shadow still carries the loneliness and hunger for care. A survivor of betrayal may build a life on the surface of independence and control, but the shadow still carries the wound of trust broken. These hidden aspects don't vanish. They wait for recognition. Jung insisted that true healing requires turning toward the shadow, not to destroy it, not to suppress it further, but to face it and integrate it. This is terrifying work. To confront the shadow is to meet the parts of yourself you least want to see: your rage, your grief, your jealousy, your shame. But Jung believed that within the shadow lies not only the wound, but also the energy, the creativity, and the wholeness we need to grow. The shadow is not just darkness. It is also potential. Think of the shadow as a locked room in your house. For years, you have avoided opening the door because you are afraid of what you will find. But as long as it remains locked, the house is incomplete. The energy trapped inside may leak out in strange ways, in nightmares, in emotional breakdowns, in destructive choices. Opening the door does not mean the room becomes pleasant overnight, but by stepping inside, by seeing what is there, you begin to reclaim it as part of your home. The same is true for the psyche. By facing the shadow, we reclaim the parts of ourselves that trauma forced us to abandon. This is why Jung connected the shadow so directly to trauma healing. If trauma splits the psyche, if it pushes unbearable experiences into the unconscious, then integration is the process of bringing them back into awareness. This does not mean reliving every painful moment. It means recognizing, yes, this happened. Yes, this part of me exists, and I will no longer exile it. That recognition is profoundly healing. It restores balance to the psyche. But Jung also warned, the shadow is not to be taken lightly. If confronted carelessly, it can overwhelm us. This is why he emphasized the importance of guidance, through therapy, through dreams, through symbolic work. The shadow must be approached with respect, like a wild animal. Too much avoidance, and it takes control from the dark. Too much force, and it may consume us. Healing comes through a patient, conscious relationship with it. In myths and stories across cultures, the shadow appears as the monster, the dragon, the beast in the cave. The hero cannot complete their journey without facing it. To slay the dragon is not only to defeat an enemy, it is to confront the hidden fears and wounds within. Trauma, in this symbolic sense, gives each of us our own dragon to face. The wound is personal, but the pattern is universal. The journey into the shadow is the same journey that myths have described for thousands of years. The journey into darkness that leads to transformation. So, when Jung spoke of the shadow, he was not describing a flaw in human nature. He was describing a necessary dimension of the psyche, a place where trauma often hides, but also where healing can begin. Because the moment you face your shadow, the moment you turn toward the pain instead of away from it, you begin to reclaim your power. The shadow ceases to be just darkness. It becomes a source of light, of strength, and of wholeness. Jung's message is clear. The parts of ourselves we fear the most are often the very parts we need to heal. Part 4. Individuation. If the shadow represents the hidden, wounded parts of ourselves, then the process of healing, for Jung, is captured in a word that may sound unfamiliar but is deeply profound: individuation. Individuation is the journey of becoming whole. It is the lifelong process of integrating the conscious and the unconscious, the light and the dark, the known and the unknown parts of who we are. Most people believe healing means going back to how things were before. We think, if only I could erase this trauma, I'd return to the person I used to be. But Jung would disagree. He believed that trauma changes us permanently, and the goal is not to erase the wound, but to grow into someone larger, more complete because of it. Individuation is not about going back. It is about going forward, into the person you were always meant to become. So, what does individuation look like? Imagine your psyche as a great circle. At the center lies the self, the true core of your being. Around the edges of the circle lies the persona, the mask you show to the world. Polite, controlled, socially acceptable. Somewhere in the darkness lies the shadow, containing everything you hide from others and from yourself. Individuation is the process of bringing all these pieces into dialogue so that the whole circle is acknowledged. It is about becoming a complete human being, not a one-sided mask. Trauma interrupts individuation. It splits the circle. It pushes parts of us into exile. For instance, a person who was shamed for showing sadness as a child may exile their grief into the shadow. Their conscious identity may become hardened, stoic, untouchable. But the circle is incomplete. Individuation would require this person to slowly reconnect with their grief, to acknowledge it not as weakness, but as part of their humanity. By doing so, they don't just recover what was lost. They expand their capacity to feel, to love, to empathize. They become more whole. Jung often used the metaphor of alchemy to describe individuation. In alchemy, the goal was to turn base metals into gold. For Jung, trauma is the base metal, heavy, ugly, and painful. Through the process of individuation, this raw material is transformed. The wound, when faced and integrated, becomes the source of wisdom, resilience, and even beauty. Jung suggested that our greatest psychological gold is often hidden in the very places we least want to look. But individuation is not easy. It asks us to confront contradictions within ourselves. You may be strong and vulnerable, kind and selfish, loving and resentful, all at the same time. Trauma tends to split these polarities, forcing us to identify with one side and deny the other. Individuation heals by uniting the opposites. It does not demand that you choose between strength and vulnerability. It teaches you that true wholeness includes both. Let's take a practical example. Imagine someone who has survived betrayal in a relationship. Their conscious identity may shift into distrust, hyper-independence, and emotional distance. They tell themselves, "I will never be vulnerable again." On the surface, this feels like strength. But in truth, it is only half of the self. The shadow holds the other half. The longing for intimacy, the capacity for trust, the desire for connection. Individuation would mean slowly, carefully, reintegrating this lost half, not by denying the pain of betrayal, but by acknowledging both truths. Yes, betrayal hurt me, and yes, I still long to connect. By holding both, the person grows into a more complex and authentic self. This is why Jung saw individuation not as a luxury, but as a necessity for healing trauma. Without individuation, we remain divided, half in light, half in shadow, constantly at war within ourselves. But through individuation, the split begins to heal. The pain is not erased, but it becomes part of a larger whole. The trauma is not the end of the story. It becomes one chapter in a much greater narrative, the story of becoming who you truly are. In myths and spiritual traditions, this process often appears as the hero's journey. The hero leaves the familiar world, descends into the underworld, faces trials and monsters, and eventually returns transformed. Trauma, in this symbolic sense, is our descent into the underworld. Individuation is the journey back, not as the same person who left, but as someone who has faced the darkness and found the light within it. This is not just psychology. It is mythology come alive in our own lives. Jung described individuation as a dialogue between the conscious and the unconscious. The conscious mind cannot simply dictate healing. It must learn to listen to dreams, to symbols, to the emotions that rise uninvited. These are the messages of the unconscious, guiding us toward integration. Healing is not a straight line. It is a spiral, moving again and again through the same themes until balance is achieved. Perhaps the most radical idea of individuation is this: our wounds are not obstacles to our wholeness. They are part of the path itself. The trauma you carry is not the opposite of your healing. It is the material of your healing. Individuation transforms trauma from a source of suffering into a source of meaning. And when this happens, the circle of the psyche begins to close. The fragmented self begins to feel whole again. So, individuation is not about becoming perfect or transcending your humanity. It is about becoming real, embracing your light, your shadow, your wounds, your strengths, and seeing them as pieces of one great whole. Jung believed that when we walk this path, trauma ceases to be just pain from the past. It becomes the crucible through which we discover our true self. Part 5. Dreams. If the shadow is where trauma hides, then one of the most important gateways Jung identified for reaching it is the world of dreams. For Jung, dreams were not meaningless fragments of the sleeping brain. They were messages from the unconscious, speaking in a symbolic language that often reveals the very wounds we try to ignore. Most of us think of dreams as strange, random, or even silly. We wake up and say, "That was weird," and quickly forget them. But Jung took dreams seriously. He believed they were the psyche's way of balancing us, of communicating truths that the conscious mind refuses to face. Where trauma has blocked the flow of life, dreams often return again and again to the blocked place, pointing toward the wound and the possibility of healing. Consider this. A person who has experienced abandonment might repeatedly dream of being lost in a vast city, unable to find their way home. Another who carries anger repressed since childhood might dream of fire, erupting uncontrollably. Someone burdened by guilt might dream of standing before a judge, awaiting punishment. To Jung, these are not accidents. They are living images, crafted by the unconscious to show us the reality of our inner world. Dreams speak in symbols, not in literal terms. A house in a dream, for instance, often represents the dreamer's own psyche. Different rooms may symbolize different aspects of the self. If a room is locked, it may point to repressed trauma. If a basement is dark and flooded, it may signal overwhelming emotions buried deep inside. Jung believed that by learning to interpret these symbols, we can uncover the voice of the unconscious and begin to engage with the trauma it holds. But Jung also warned that dream symbols are deeply personal. While water may symbolize emotions in one person's dream, it could represent something entirely different in another. That is why he insisted that dream interpretation is not about following a dictionary of meanings, but about dialogue. Asking, what does this image mean to me? What does it remind me of? How does it feel? In this way, the dream becomes a mirror, reflecting both the trauma and the path to healing. Dreams can also guide us toward integration. Jung noticed that when people began to face their trauma consciously, their dreams would shift. The symbols of terror might give way to symbols of transformation. A dream of drowning might eventually become a dream of swimming. A dream of being chased might transform into one of standing still and facing the pursuer. These changes reflected real healing within the psyche. The unconscious was showing progress, the shadow being acknowledged, the trauma slowly finding its place in the whole self. One of Jung's most powerful methods of working with trauma was through active imagination, which often began with a dream image. If a dream revealed a monster, Jung encouraged the dreamer to visualize it consciously, to meet it, to ask it questions. Instead of running away, the dreamer entered into dialogue with the symbol. This was not about controlling the dream, but about listening. The monster might say, "I carry your anger." The flood might say, "I am the tears you never cried." In this way, the unconscious speaks, and the trauma hidden within symbols begins to come alive in a form that can be faced. Dreams also connect us to something larger than ourselves, the collective unconscious. When we dream of archetypal figures, the wise old man, the mother, the hero, the shadow, we are tapping into universal patterns that all humans share. This is why trauma often feels so mythic in dreams. We do not just dream of our own pain, we dream of dragons, of battles, of apocalypses. These are archetypal images, showing that our trauma is not only personal, but also part of the timeless human story of suffering and transformation. By recognizing these patterns, we begin to give meaning to our pain, seeing it not as meaningless suffering, but as part of a larger process of growth. Jung suggested that healing through dreams is not about finding one final answer. It is about cultivating a relationship with the unconscious, learning to listen night after night to the images that arise. Each dream is like a letter sent from the depths of the soul. Some are warnings, some are encouragement, some are instructions for the next step of the journey. And together, they form a dialogue between the conscious self that longs to heal and the unconscious that carries the keys to healing. So, why are dreams so vital in the healing of trauma? Because trauma hides in the unconscious, and dreams are the doorway to that hidden realm. Through dreams, the unconscious tells its story. It shows us the pain we have buried, and it offers us the images we need to transform that pain. Dreams are the bridge between the shadow and individuation, between the wound and the possibility of wholeness. In this sense, Jung believed that every dream, even the darkest nightmare, is a gift. For within its symbols lies not only the reflection of our trauma, but also the seeds of our healing. To ignore dreams is to ignore the voice of the unconscious. But to honor them, to listen, to explore their meanings, is to begin the journey of transformation. And for those who carry trauma, that journey can be life-changing. Part 6. Symbols, Archetypes, and Myth. If dreams are the language of the unconscious, then symbols are its alphabet. For Jung, symbols are not mere decorations of the mind. They are living bridges between the conscious and unconscious worlds, carriers of meaning that can reveal the path toward healing. When we are wounded by trauma, words often fail us. We say, "I can't explain what I feel," or "it's beyond words." Jung believed that this was precisely why the psyche turns to symbols. Symbols can carry what ordinary language cannot. A dream of a broken mirror may communicate the shattering of identity after trauma. A recurring image of a child may point to the inner child who still suffers. A recurring mountain might symbolize the challenge of growth, the painful ascent toward healing. In this way, the unconscious expresses what trauma has silenced. Symbols are not only personal. Jung discovered that across cultures, people dream and imagine using the same patterns, the same timeless figures. He called these archetypes, the universal images that live in the collective unconscious of all humanity. Archetypes are like ancient blueprints, shaping the way our psyche tells its stories. And when trauma strikes, these archetypes often emerge to help us face the unimaginable. One of the most powerful archetypes is the hero. In countless myths, the hero is called to adventure, faces great danger, and must confront monsters before bringing back treasure. To Jung, this was not just a story. It was the inner journey of the human soul. A trauma survivor may dream of being chased, trapped, or lost, but eventually, the archetype of the hero can appear. The part of the psyche that dares to fight, to survive, and to reclaim life. By recognizing the hero within, the individual begins to see themselves not only as a victim of trauma, but also as a participant in a universal story of transformation. Another archetype that often arises in trauma is the shadow. We met the shadow earlier as the container of repressed pain and emotion. But in symbolic form, the shadow often appears as a monster, a pursuer, a terrifying figure. Jung insisted that the shadow is not our enemy, but our teacher. The monster may symbolize the rage, grief, or fear we have buried. By confronting the monster symbolically, whether in dreams, art, or imagination, we begin to acknowledge the reality of our trauma and allow it to be integrated into our conscious life. Then there is the wise old man or wise woman archetype, symbols of guidance that appear when the psyche is ready for healing. In times of despair, people may dream of a mentor, a healer, or a mysterious figure who offers a key, a map, or a piece of wisdom. Jung believed these archetypes emerge when the unconscious senses that the individual is ready to face their pain. They represent inner wisdom rising to the surface, often in the exact moment it is needed most. The archetype of the Great Mother is also essential in trauma work. For those who suffered abandonment, rejection, or neglect, dreams of a nurturing figure, sometimes a literal mother, sometimes an animal, sometimes a goddess, can carry immense healing. The Great Mother archetype restores the possibility of comfort, of belonging, of being held. Even if the individual never received such care in life, the psyche itself can generate this image as a way of mending the wound. But symbols and archetypes are not limited to dreams. They are everywhere, woven into myths, religions, art, and even popular culture. Jung believed that myths are not just ancient stories. They are mirrors of the psyche. The myth of Orpheus, descending into the underworld, mirrors the experience of revisiting trauma. The myth of the phoenix, rising from the ashes, reflects the transformation that healing makes possible. Even modern films and novels often echo these timeless archetypes. Superheroes, mentors, villains, rebirth, all speak to the same deep psychic patterns. Why is this important for healing trauma? Because trauma often isolates us. It makes us feel alone, as though our pain is unique, unspeakable, and disconnected from others. But when we recognize our trauma reflected in symbols and archetypes, we see that our suffering is part of the universal human experience. The person who dreams of a dragon may realize that they are not the first nor the last to face such a beast. Humanity has always faced dragons, and humanity has always told stories of defeating them. In this recognition, trauma gains meaning. It becomes not only a wound, but also a call to transformation. Jung often emphasized that symbols work by engaging the imagination. A person may consciously meditate on a dream image, draw it, paint it, or write about it. In doing so, they are not escaping reality. They are entering into dialogue with the unconscious. Through this dialogue, the symbol slowly reveals its meaning. A dream of a broken bridge might, over time, be understood as a symbol of trust, shattered by betrayal. Working with this symbol may help the individual explore their pain, confront their anger, and eventually begin to build a new bridge within themselves and in relationships with others. Symbols are living things. They are not static definitions but evolving guides. As Jung said, a true symbol cannot be fully explained, only experienced. Its meaning deepens over time, shifting as the psyche itself transforms. For those who carry trauma, this means that the symbols encountered in dreams and imagination can serve as companions along the healing journey, appearing again and again in new forms, each time offering a deeper layer of insight and integration. In the end, Jung believed that to heal trauma is not simply to get over it or erase it, but to find a way to give it meaning, to weave it into the larger fabric of life. Symbols and archetypes are the threads that allow this weaving. They show us that our pain, as unbearable as it may be, is also part of the timeless human story of loss, struggle, transformation, and renewal. They remind us that we are never alone in our suffering, and that within us live not only wounds, but also the archetypal forces of healing, wisdom, and rebirth. To look at our trauma through symbols is to see it not as meaningless suffering, but as myth in motion, as a story unfolding in which we are both the wounded and the healer, the lost and the one who finds the way home. And in that realization, the journey of individuation deepens, guiding us step by step toward wholeness. Part 7. Jungian Therapeutic Tools. Up to this point, we've explored Jung's ideas about the shadow, dreams, and archetypes. But the question remains, how do these concepts translate into actual healing? Jung was not only a thinker, he was also a practitioner. He developed methods to help people work directly with their unconscious, to transform trauma into growth. Perhaps the most powerful of these methods is what he called active imagination. Active imagination begins with a simple but radical idea that the unconscious is not just a silent force, but a living presence that can be engaged with directly. Instead of merely analyzing dreams after they occur, Jung invited his patients to continue the dream while awake, to enter into dialogue with the figures and symbols that appear. In this way, the unconscious is no longer a mystery locked away in sleep. It becomes an active partner in healing. Here's how it works. A person might recall a dream of being pursued by a terrifying figure. In active imagination, they would close their eyes, return to that image, and allow the story to continue. But this time, they are not passive. They can ask the pursuer, "Who are you? What do you want from me?" The figure may respond in surprising ways, sometimes hostile, sometimes revealing hidden truths. Jung discovered that these dialogues often reveal the emotional core of trauma. The pursuer might say, "I am your rage," or "I am the pain you never faced." Suddenly, what was once only terror becomes meaningful. The trauma takes shape in symbolic form, and by engaging with it, the individual begins to integrate what was once unbearable. Active imagination can take many forms. Some people draw or paint their dream images. Others write dialogues between themselves and the figures that appear. Some even use movement or music to embody these inner experiences. Jung himself filled entire notebooks with his active imagination experiments, what he called the Red Book, a record of his own descent into the unconscious and his encounters with its figures. For him, this was not art for art's sake, but a profound therapeutic practice, a way to listen to the psyche and allow healing symbols to emerge. What makes active imagination so powerful for trauma healing is that it gives form to what is otherwise formless. Trauma often manifests as a vague sense of dread, a bodily pain with no words, a flood of emotion that feels overwhelming. By turning these experiences into images, characters, and symbols, the psyche creates a container, a way for the conscious mind to approach and interact with the wound. Instead of drowning in the raw intensity of trauma, the individual can step into dialogue with it, learn from it, and slowly integrate it. But active imagination is not easy. Jung warned that it requires courage and patience. The unconscious does not always reveal pleasant truths. Sometimes it confronts us with our darkest fears, our buried anger, our deepest grief. For trauma survivors, this can be difficult, even destabilizing. Jung believed that such practices should ideally be done with the support of a therapist or guide, someone who can help anchor the process when the images become overwhelming. Healing through active imagination is not about escaping into fantasy. It is about facing the truth of the psyche in symbolic form. Beyond active imagination, Jung also emphasized the importance of creative expression. Trauma often silences the voice, making it hard to articulate pain. But through art, music, and writing, the unconscious finds pathways to speak. Many of Jung's patients who could not verbalize their suffering began to draw mandalas, circular symbols of wholeness. Jung noticed that these mandalas often emerged spontaneously during healing, representing the psyche's attempt to restore balance after trauma. By engaging in such creative practices, people give their inner world a chance to express itself, bypassing the limitations of ordinary language. Another technique Jung valued was ritual. Not ritual in the religious sense alone, but personal rituals that mark transition and transformation. Trauma can leave us stuck, frozen in the moment of injury. By creating rituals, writing letters to the past self, burning symbols of old pain, creating altars or sacred spaces, the psyche signals that a shift is taking place. Rituals anchor the invisible work of healing in visible acts, giving the unconscious a structure within which transformation can occur. Jung also believed strongly in the body as part of the healing process. Trauma is not only stored in the mind, it is carried in the muscles, the breath, the nervous system. While Jung did not develop body-based therapies himself, his emphasis on the psyche as an embodied reality opened the door for later practices, like somatic therapy and expressive movement, that integrate body and psyche. For Jung, the goal was always wholeness, the recognition that mind, body, and spirit are inseparable in the process of healing. It is important to note that Jung never promised quick fixes. He spoke of healing as a lifelong dialogue with the unconscious, a process he called individuation. Active imagination, dream work, symbols, and rituals are not techniques to erase trauma overnight. Instead, they are practices that slowly transform the relationship we have with our wounds. They shift trauma from being a silent tyrant in the unconscious to becoming a meaningful part of the self's story. For many survivors, this shift can be profound. Instead of seeing themselves only as broken, they begin to see themselves as participants in an inner journey. The trauma becomes not just a scar, but a symbol of transformation, like the mythical hero who returns from the underworld with wisdom, or the phoenix that rises from its ashes. Active imagination and symbolic practices help the individual embody this mythic arc in their own life, turning pain into meaning and wounds into wisdom. Perhaps one of the most moving aspects of Jung's approach is his deep respect for the unconscious. He did not treat it as an enemy to be defeated, but as a guide that, even in trauma, is always seeking healing. The nightmares, the disturbing images, the strange symbols, these are not signs of pathology, but messages from the depths of the psyche, urging us toward growth. When we learn to listen, to imagine, to create, we enter into cooperation with the unconscious. And in that cooperation, trauma slowly transforms into something new, not a prison, but a path. In the end, Jung's techniques for healing trauma remind us that the psyche itself wants to heal. Dreams, symbols, and imagination are not random. They are the soul's way of pointing us toward integration. The work is not easy. It demands patience, courage, and openness to mystery. But for those willing to embark on the journey, active imagination and creative practice offer a way to transform wounds into wisdom and pain into a deeper sense of wholeness. Part 8. The importance of meeting the self. We have explored the shadow, dreams, symbols, and the tools Jung offered for engaging the unconscious. Now, we arrive at perhaps the most profound aspect of Jungian psychology, the encounter with the self. To Jung, the self is not merely a part of the psyche, it is its center, its organizing principle, the core around which all other parts revolve. The self represents wholeness. It is the totality of the conscious and unconscious, the light and the dark, the known and the hidden. It is not the ego, the everyday I that we identify with, but the deeper center that integrates all opposites. To encounter the self is to come into contact with this inner wholeness, to touch the core of what it means to be fully human. Trauma, however, disrupts this connection. It forces parts of the psyche into exile. The shadow grows, dreams become chaotic, and symbols lose their coherence. Trauma pulls us away from the self, leaving us fragmented, disoriented, and disconnected from our deepest core. The wound is not only emotional or psychological, it is a rupture in the relationship with our own center. The self is present, but its guidance is obscured, hidden behind layers of fear, shame, and avoidance. Healing, then, is essentially a journey back to the self. It is the process of reconnecting with the center of the psyche, restoring the flow between conscious awareness and unconscious wisdom. This does not mean erasing trauma or pretending the wound never existed. On the contrary, Jung emphasized that true healing involves acknowledging the trauma fully, integrating its lessons, and allowing the psyche to reclaim the parts of itself that were lost or suppressed. The encounter with the self often manifests symbolically. In dreams, it may appear as a luminous figure, a wise guide, a circle, or a mandala, a perfect symbol of unity and wholeness. These images are not abstract. They are alive, speaking directly to the individual, guiding the process of integration. By attending to these symbols, the psyche slowly leads the person toward the experience of wholeness, offering insight, comfort, and guidance. This reconnection with the self is the heart of Jungian trauma healing. When the self becomes accessible again, the individual begins to see that their identity is more than the trauma they have suffered. The wound remains, but it no longer defines the totality of the person. The self allows the psyche to reorganize itself around a central core rather than around pain, fear, or repression. Fragmented aspects of the personality, the shadow, the exiled inner child, repressed emotions, begin to return to the whole, and the psyche slowly restores its balance. Jung often used the metaphor of the self as a guiding star. Even in the darkest nights of the psyche, the self is present, offering direction. Trauma clouds this star with layers of confusion, shame, and fear. The journey of healing is about lifting these clouds, clearing the path, and allowing the light of the self to shine. The closer we come to the self, the more our decisions, our relationships, and our creativity are informed by wholeness rather than by fragmented reactions to past wounds. The importance of the encounter with the self cannot be overstated. It transforms the way we relate to ourselves and to life. Where trauma left us isolated, afraid, or reactive, the self restores a sense of inner security. Where we once felt fragmented, the self creates coherence. Where the shadow dominated unconsciously, the self invites conscious integration. Healing becomes not merely about reducing symptoms or escaping pain. It becomes a process of becoming whole. Ultimately, the journey to the self is the journey to reclaim our interior totality. Trauma may have driven us away, but the self is always waiting, patiently, within the depths of the psyche. By turning toward it through dreams, symbols, imagination, and reflection, we restore a connection that was never truly lost. We reintegrate our shadow, embrace our hidden feelings, and reestablish our relationship with our own center. In practical terms, this means listening to our inner guidance, attending to the symbolic language of dreams, engaging creatively with unconscious material, and honoring the parts of ourselves that have been neglected. It is a process that requires courage, patience, and compassion. But it is also the pathway to a profound transformation. The recognition that trauma does not have the final word, and that the self, our inner center, is always available to guide us toward wholeness. In essence, the encounter with the self transforms trauma from an exile into an invitation. It turns fragmentation into integration, pain into insight, and disconnection into a profound sense of unity. By reconnecting with the self, we do not erase our wounds, but we reclaim our lives. We reclaim the fullness of our being. The journey of Jungian psychology shows us that the ultimate healing is not just relief from suffering, but the rediscovery of our own interior totality. Part 9. Difference between Jung and Freud in their view of trauma. As we come to the final part of our journey, it is important to understand how Jung's approach to trauma differs fundamentally from that of his contemporary, Sigmund Freud. Both were pioneers of the psyche, but their perspectives diverged sharply when it came to the nature of trauma and its role in personal development. Freud viewed trauma primarily through the lens of repression. According to Freud, traumatic experiences are pushed out of conscious awareness because they are too threatening or painful to face. These repressed memories and emotions, if not addressed, can manifest as neuroses, anxiety, or other psychological symptoms. Healing, in the Freudian model, involves uncovering these repressed memories, bringing them into conscious awareness, and resolving the past. The focus is on the trauma as an event in history, something that happened and must be remembered, analyzed, and released. Jung, however, offered a radically different perspective. He acknowledged the reality of trauma and the pain it causes, but he emphasized something beyond mere recollection: the transformation and integration of trauma into the larger journey of the psyche. Jung saw trauma not only as a wound to be healed, but as an opportunity for growth. The central question was not just, "What happened to you?" but, "How can this experience lead you toward wholeness?" Where Freud focused on the past, Jung focused on the present and the potential future. He recognized that trauma often disrupts the balance of the psyche, but he believed the psyche contains within it the means for restoration. Dreams, symbols, archetypes, and active imagination are not simply reflections of what happened. They are guides toward integration, offering a path for the individual to incorporate the trauma into a larger process of individuation. In other words, trauma is not only a problem to solve, it is raw material for transformation. For Freud, healing trauma is largely about reduction, reducing anxiety, resolving conflicts, and bringing repressed memories into consciousness. For Jung, healing trauma is about expansion, expanding the personality, integrating the shadow, reconnecting with the self, and achieving a new sense of wholeness. Jungian therapy does not seek to erase the wound. It seeks to turn it into a source of meaning, creativity, and self-understanding. Consider this in practical terms. A person who experienced betrayal might, in Freudian analysis, revisit the memory repeatedly, analyze their feelings, and come to a conscious understanding of the event. The goal is insight into the past. In Jungian therapy, the same person would not only examine the memory, but also explore the archetypal and symbolic dimensions of the experience. What inner patterns it reveals, how it affects their shadow, and what creative or transformative potential it holds. The trauma becomes part of a larger narrative that contributes to the individual's individuation. This difference reflects a profound philosophical divergence. Freud treats the psyche almost as a battlefield, where hidden enemies, repressed memories and impulses, must be confronted and neutralized. Jung treats the psyche as a living organism, capable of self-healing, guidance, and transformation. Trauma is not simply an obstacle, it is a doorway into the deeper, richer layers of the self. In this light, Jung's approach is uniquely hopeful. While trauma is undeniably painful, it also contains the possibility of growth, wisdom, and creativity. Dreams, symbols, and the encounter with the self are not merely therapeutic tools. They are invitations to transform suffering into meaning. Healing becomes not just a return to a previous state, but a journey toward a new and more integrated self. Understanding this distinction is crucial for anyone interested in the psychology of trauma. Freud teaches us the importance of memory, acknowledgement, and insight. Jung teaches us that trauma, when engaged consciously and creatively, can catalyze profound personal evolution. One focuses on the past, the other guides us toward the wholeness of the future. Ultimately, Jung invites us to see trauma not as a permanent scar, but as a teacher. Freud shows us how to understand the wound. Jung shows us how to transform it. In the encounter with the self, through dreams, symbols, and imagination, trauma ceases to be merely something we endure. It becomes a doorway to becoming fully human, fully aware, and fully alive. In conclusion, the difference between Freud and Jung in understanding trauma is not about who is right or wrong. It is about perspective. Freud illuminates the past. Jung illuminates the path toward integration, growth, and wholeness. And for those willing to journey inward, Jung's vision offers the profound possibility that even our deepest wounds can lead us to our truest, most complete selves. Part 10. Practical examples and analogies. To make Jung's ideas about trauma and healing more tangible, let's explore some practical examples and metaphors. These are not stories of real patients, but illustrative cases that show how his concepts can appear in everyday life. Imagine a young adult who has repeatedly felt rejected in relationships. In their dreams, they might see themselves wandering alone through vast, empty landscapes. Initially, these dreams evoke fear and loneliness. Through active imagination, they begin to dialogue with the figures in the dream. The empty landscapes transform into paths lined with trees and light. The lonely wanderer begins to meet symbolic guides, perhaps a wise figure or a supportive animal, representing inner resources they had not recognized. This illustrates how trauma can manifest in imagery and how engaging creatively with the unconscious can reveal strength and guidance that was always present, though hidden. Consider another example. Someone who grew up in a chaotic household may feel an overwhelming need for control. In dreams, they may encounter rooms that are locked or falling apart, symbolizing feelings of helplessness and fear. By drawing these images or reflecting on them through symbolic dialogue, they begin to understand that these symbols represent past trauma, not present reality. Over time, they may visualize these rooms being repaired, doors opening, and light entering, symbolizing the integration of their shadow and reconnection with their inner self. Metaphors are especially powerful in Jungian therapy. Think of trauma as a wound. In the immediate aftermath, the wound is raw, painful, and sensitive. But with time, reflection, and integration, it becomes a scar. That scar does not hide the fact that there was pain, but it transforms the wound into a symbol of resilience. It is a visible marker of survival and healing. Similarly, trauma, when acknowledged and worked through, becomes part of the person's strength and depth, not only a source of suffering. Another illustrative analogy comes from nature. Consider a tree struck by lightning. The tree is damaged, its trunk scarred, but it continues to grow, sometimes even producing new branches that are stronger and more beautiful because of the experience. Trauma in the psyche works similarly. It may break a person in one sense, but when the unconscious is engaged and the self is reconnected, the psyche often grows in ways that would not have been possible without the challenge. Let's imagine a person who has struggled with intense shame due to past mistakes. Their dreams might show them trapped in a dark room, unable to leave. Initially, this represents the isolation trauma can create. Through symbolic work, they might imagine the room slowly filling with light, revealing a doorway or a mirror reflecting their true self. This symbolizes recognition and integration. The self is guiding them toward acceptance, transforming fear into understanding. The trauma remains, but it is now part of a coherent narrative, giving it meaning and a place in the journey of individuation. Even in everyday life, these symbolic processes occur naturally. A person who channels emotional pain into art, music, or writing is engaging the unconscious and giving form to what was previously inexpressible. A person who helps others after experiencing suffering is transforming their trauma into empathy, compassion, and connection. Jung emphasized that these actions are practical manifestations of the healing process, showing how the psyche seeks to restore wholeness even after disruption. Finally, let's consider a metaphor of water. Trauma can feel like a flood, overwhelming and uncontrollable. At first, it destroys the landscape of the psyche, leaving confusion and despair. But through conscious engagement with the unconscious, through dreams, imagination, symbols, the flood can be redirected. It nourishes the soil, fills lakes, and supports new growth. In this way, what initially seemed destructive becomes life-giving, illustrating how trauma, when integrated, contributes to the richness and resilience of the psyche. These examples and metaphors show us that Jung's approach is not abstract. It is deeply practical. Healing trauma involves engaging with images, symbols, and the inner dialogue of the psyche. It involves recognizing that pain carries potential for transformation, that wounds can become marks of strength, and that the unconscious offers guidance toward wholeness. By imagining, reflecting, and creating, we actively participate in our own healing journey. In essence, trauma is not simply something to endure. It is a teacher. Through illustrative examples and metaphors, we can see how even the most difficult experiences can be transformed into sources of insight, resilience, and integration. The path Jung describes is both imaginative and practical, showing us how to turn suffering into growth and isolation into connection with the deeper self. Conclusion. As we reach the end of our journey through Jung's understanding of trauma, it is essential to pause and reflect on what we have learned. Jung did not view trauma as something to be eliminated, forgotten, or simply endured. Instead, he saw it as a part of the psyche. A challenge, yes, but also a potential source of insight, growth, and transformation. Trauma can fragment us, pull us away from our center, and obscure our connection with the self. But through dreams, symbols, archetypes, and active engagement with the unconscious, we have the opportunity to integrate what was once hidden. Trauma, when acknowledged and worked through, can become a teacher rather than a tyrant. It can guide us toward wholeness, toward understanding the depths of our own psyche, and toward embracing the totality of who we are. In Jungian terms, healing is not about returning to a previous state or erasing the past. It is about connecting with our inner self, the center of our being, and allowing the psyche to reorganize itself around wholeness rather than fragmentation. The wound, once integrated, can become a source of creativity, empathy, resilience, and wisdom. The scar is a symbol not of weakness, but of survival and strength. To put it simply, trauma, when consciously engaged, can transform into growth. It can shape us, deepen us, and teach us lessons that no easy comfort could provide. The journey through suffering becomes a journey toward self-discovery, toward individuation, and toward the authentic life that Jung envisioned for every human being. Perhaps the most profound takeaway from Jung's work is this: your wounds do not define you, but how you meet them can. By facing your inner darkness, exploring your dreams and symbols, and reconnecting with the self, You are invited to become who you truly are. Jung often reminded us that the goal of psychological work is not simply happiness or relief. It is authenticity. To be fully alive is to be fully oneself, even with the scars we carry. As we conclude, take a moment to reflect on your own life. What parts of your psyche have been wounded or neglected? Which symbols, dreams, or inner voices might be calling you toward integration? Trauma is not just an obstacle, it is a doorway. How might you step through it to discover deeper meaning, connection, and wholeness within yourself? In the words of Jung, the journey is never simple, but it is worth it. To know yourself fully, to embrace both your light and your shadow, and to reclaim the totality of your being. Your pain can teach you, your wounds can guide you, and through conscious engagement with your inner world, you can emerge not only healed, but whole, truly, authentically, and powerfully yourself. This is the promise of Jungian psychology, that even in our darkest moments, the path to wholeness is always present, waiting for those willing to take the first step toward the self.